always been your position, Mr. Johnson?
Yes.
Could we have 265619, please, page 68? This is a WhatsApp between your former Permanent Secretary, number 10, and then latterly Cabinet Secretary, and your principal private secretary, Simon Cain, respectively Martin Reynolds. And the Cabinet Secretary said the Prime Minister is mad if he doesn't think his WhatsApps will become public via the COVID inquiry. He was clearly not in the mood for that discussion tonight. That date, the 20th of December 2021, was just 5 days after you had in fact appointed Milady as the chair of this inquiry. Was there a debate at that time within government as to whether or not your WhatsApps should be disclosed? And if so, whether or not they would become public by virtue of their disclosure in this process?
I don't remember that, the conversation to which the Cabinet Secretary is referring, and I've handed over all the relevant WhatsApps.
The inquiry has indeed requested all the key COVID-related texts, WhatsApps and so on from January 20 to February 22, and it must be made absolutely clear that throughout the course of the litigation in the summer and throughout these proceedings, you have made available, it would seem, everything in your possession. You made clear, I think, through your solicitors, however, that you had a phone which you used from May 2021, and you've made available the WhatsApps and the emails from that phone, therefore, between May 21 and February 22, the end of the period that the inquiry was requesting about. But following a well-publicised security breach, you had not been able to use to access the previous phone because you'd stopped using it, and you were fearful that if you tried to access it, you'd delete its data. Is that right?
That's right.
Were you able to get access ultimately to the contents of that first phone, the old phone?
Yes, so we sent it off to some technical people and they activated it.
Was there a time gap, as your solicitors have described it, on that phone, a period between the 30th of January 2020 and June 2020, during which time the WhatsApps have not been capable of being reinstalled and disclosed?
That's right.
Do you know why your phone was missing those 5,000 odd WhatsApps?
I don't know the exact reason, but it looks as though it's something to do with the app going down and then coming up again, but somehow not automatically erasing all the things between that date when it went down and the moment when it was last backed up. So I can't give you the technical explanation, but that's the best I'm able to give.
The technical report that your solicitors kindly provided demonstrates that there may have been a factory reset of the phone at the end of January 2020 and then an attempt to reinstall the contents later in June 2020. May I just ask you this? Was it you, if that was a factory reset that was done, was it you that tried to reset the phone or not?
A factory reset?
There is a device or a capability on the phone which allows its contents to be entirely reset. That wasn't you.
I don't remember any such thing.
All right. And during the course of the litigation this summer, between the inquiry and the Cabinet Office, did you, of course, make plain your stated wish that the WhatsApps, which were the subject of that litigation, should be disclosed?
Yes.
They being your own WhatsApps. All right.
Can I, for the avoidance of doubt, make it absolutely clear I haven't removed any WhatsApps from my phone, and I've given you everything that I think you need.
I ask, Mr. Johnson, because this issue has been trailed in the press.
Yeah, no, I get you.
And it's important that you have an opportunity of explaining why those WhatsApps are not available. In your witness statement, at paragraph 10, you say, Mr. Johnson, that unquestionably mistakes were made. And for those, you say you unreservedly apologise. We have the statement there. I'd like you, please, to set out in broad terms, of course we'll be looking at the detail of it later, but in broad terms, what mistakes you refer to there. Bearing in mind that we are only concerned in this module, Mr. Johnson, with the core decision-making, with the lockdown decisions, the NPIs, the non-pharmaceutical interventions and so on, not vaccines, therapeutics, antivirals.
Okay.
What mistakes do you unquestionably accept were made?
Well, I think if you look at my statement, I point out that we were relying so much on messaging to help contain the virus, and we needed the public to understand the message in as straightforward a way as possible, and they really did, by and large. One problem we had that I mention is that because of the very natural and proper right of the devolved administrations to have their own approach, sometimes there was a bit of so the BBC News would have one message from number 10, then a slightly different one from Scotland or wherever, and that I think we need to sort that out in future. And I'm sure there are plenty of other things that we could have done differently, but I have no doubt it will come to them in the course of the examination.
So your position today is, and you appear to refer to it as the first issue, that the primary mistake made rests in the context of the messaging and the communications with the devolved administration.
Well, you asked me to cite a mistake that we made. I didn't say that was the primary mistake.
What primary mistakes, Mr. Johnson, are you referring to in paragraph 10 when you say there was terrible suffering, but in relation to which, where we failed, I apologise again? For what are you apologising in that statement?
Well, I think just to go back to your main point, which is that so many people suffered, so many people lost their lives. Inevitably, in the course of trying to handle a very, very difficult pandemic in which we had to balance appalling harms on either side of the decision, we may have made mistakes. I don't want to try to anticipate the discussion, which I'm sure we will get into, about the timings of MPIs, of lockdowns. Inevitably, we got some things wrong. I think we were doing our best at the time, given what we knew, given the information I had available to me at the time. I think we did our level best. Were there things that we should have done differently? Unquestionably, but I would struggle to itemize them all before you now in a hierarchy. I'm afraid. I think it would be. I'd find it easier to try and explain what happened as we went through.
You say in your witness statement, I unquestionably made mistakes. Can you draw a distinction for us, please, between yourself personally and the government? To what extent do you accept personal responsibility as opposed to accepting it on behalf of your administration?
So I take personal responsibility for all the decisions that we made.
It's obvious, Mr. Johnson, that many of the most difficult and momentous decisions rested upon your own shoulders as Prime Minister. Do you take responsibility for whatever my lady makes of the speed of the government's response in January, February, March of 2020?
Of course.
And the way in which the various moving parts of the government, the advisory committees, the departments, the agencies and so on responded?
Of course.
Do you take responsibility for the lockdown decisions, whichever way they went, and their timeliness, whatever my lady makes of them? The manner in which patients were discharged from hospitals into the care sector?
Of course.
the explosion of the virus within the residential care sector. The general speed at which the restrictions were eased.
Yes.
The Eat Out to Help Out scheme. And then, latterly in 2020, the decision not to introduce a circuit breaker in September or October, or to introduce a tier system earlier when the prevalence of the virus was lower, for good or ill.
Yes, though we did have local restrictions from a very early date.
May I just ask you, please, this question? Also, you refer to mistakes. It's very important that the inquiry understands to what extent it's accepted that there were mistakes, as opposed to an acceptance that with hindsight, the government could have done better. Do you mean there were failings, things or decisions that you got avoidably wrong, whether because they were the wrong decisions or because your management and leadership meant that the right decisions were less likely to be taken?
Possible. That in your opening preamble a few months ago, you produced a slide saying that the UK was, I think, second only to Italy for excess deaths.
Correct.
That's not, to the best of my knowledge, the case. And I think that all I would say is that many other countries suffered terrible losses from COVID.
They did.
And the evidence that I've seen suggests that we were well down the European table and well down the world table. Though that is, of course, no comfort to the bereaved and their families. That seems to be the statistical reality.
The evidence before Milady is that the United Kingdom had one of the highest rates of excess death in Europe. Almost all other Western European countries had a lower level of excess death.
I've seen.
Italy was tragically in a worse position than the United Kingdom.
Well, I don't wish to contradict you, Mr. Keith, but the evidence, the ONS data I saw put us, I think, about 16th or 19th in a table of 33.
In Western Europe, we were one of the worst off, if not the second worst off. You must have long reflected since that time why that was so. Why do you think that we had the rate of excess deaths in this country that we did ultimately have?
As I say, I think that the statistics vary, and I think that every country struggled with a new pandemic, and I think the UK, from the evidence that I have seen, was well down the European table and obviously even further down the world table. If I had to answer why I think we faced particular headwinds, I would say it was irrespective of government action. We have an elderly population, extremely elderly population. We do suffer, sadly, from lots of COVID-related comorbidities, and we are a very, very densely populated country, the second most densely populated country in Europe, and that did not help.
Do you accept that government actions materially contributed to that outcome? It wasn't just a matter of the state of the healthcare system, density, age of population, and in fact, the geographical location of the United Kingdom.
Given that other countries have excellent healthcare systems and face similar problems and ended up in statistically with more excess deaths per 100,000, the answer is I don't know. I don't know.
You're obviously extremely well aware of the argument that the lockdown decisions themselves, cumulatively and individually, contributed to the number of excess deaths. What do you say to that?
I say that I don't know, but I'm aware of the arguments that are made. What I would say respectfully to people is that they were very, very difficult decisions, and the issue of the timeliness of lockdowns was clearly one that we considered very hard at the time, and you will have seen from the evidence that there was strong arguments against going too early into lockdowns, especially when it came to that first series of March NPIs. And you'll remember the arguments that were made, two arguments against early action, and they were the risk of behavioural fatigue and then the risk of bounce back, or what you've called uncoiling of the spring. And they were made powerfully, and they certainly had a big effect on me.
Could you assist the inquiry, please, with something about the nature of the heavy responsibility which rested on your shoulders? It is perhaps self-evident that only the most difficult and momentous decisions come for the Prime Minister.
That's correct.
Were there any good or easy decisions to be made in this context?
No, I can't think of a single. Well, I suppose it was an easy decision to say that we should go ahead with the rollout of both Pfizer and AstraZeneca as soon as they've been approved by the MHRA. But there were no, when it came to the, forgive me, Mr. Keith, but when it came to the balancing of the need to protect the public and protect the NHS and the damage done by lockdowns, it was incredibly difficult.
Pause there, please. I do understand emotions are running very high. I do, and I think it's most unfortunate when I have to ask people to leave. But we have to ensure that this hearing is effective, and it's got to be effective not just for people in this hearing room, but for people watching on the online streaming. So please make sure your behaviour is appropriate to a public hearing of a statutory inquiry. Thank you. Sorry to interrupt.
No, it's fine.
We'll look at the nature of the particular decisions in greater detail later. But broadly speaking, so that we know the lie of the land and we know how you approach these issues, were the majority of the most momentous decisions, the decisions, for example, to impose the lockdowns and social distancing measures and so on, were they decisions that were in practice made by you,
yes,
even if they were affirmed or endorsed by the Cabinet later, or were they decisions that were entirely open-endedly made by Cabinet?
That's a very good question, because I think it was both. A huge number of decisions, because they had to be taken so fast, were funneled up directly to me, but there were also a large number of decisions, and I do think this maybe hasn't come out as much as it should, that were the subject of exhaustive Cabinet discussion.
In his witness statement, Michael Gove has said that the wider Cabinet was brought into decisions at times too late and Javid has said in his witness statement that the Cabinet was designed, in his view, to place Dominic Cummings and the Prime Minister as the decision makers, to centralise power in number 10. And in his own witness statement, Mr. Cummings has said that the Cabinet was largely irrelevant to policy or execution on account of the leaks, your inability to chair it, and because it was seen by number 10 as not being a serious place for serious discussion.
I don't think that's true. I think there were some really excellent Cabinet discussions about the trade-offs. If I had to make a comment about Cabinet as a whole in terms of the speed of lockdowns, which was what we're talking about, I think it probably would be fair to say that the Cabinet was, on the whole, more reluctant to impose MPIs necessarily than I was. That wasn't true for every member of the Cabinet, but that would be a general comment.
The lockdown decision of the 23rd of March 2020 was debated, as you rightly say, at great length on the Sunday, on the Monday by the various bodies, but in particular COBRA. But it was debated in COBRA on Monday the 23rd. A public announcement, we'll all recall, was made that day, that evening, in fact, and then it went to Cabinet on the Tuesday. So in relation to the first lockdown decision, it's obvious that Cabinet debated it after the event. In relation to the second lockdown, that of November 2020, Mr. Johnson, do you recall whether or not that decision was made by a COVID ministerial committee or by Cabinet?
I'm afraid I can't remember the sequence there, but just picking you up on the first lockdown, which was actually a sort of crescendo of measures, I'm fairly certain we had a long Cabinet call at least to discuss it.
Well, we'll look at that in detail later. The inquiry's heard a great deal of evidence, Mr. Johnson, about the way in which your Secretaries of State would naturally and permissibly come at the same issue, whether to have a lockdown, whether to ease, whether to have a tier system and the like, from different angles. The Secretary of State for Health and Social Care, understandably, would promote the public health consequences and the need to act in the public health. The Chancellor would frequently promote the economic considerations, but all, it's obvious, were aware to greater or lesser degree of the societal and economic harm that would result from the decisions that you were having to contemplate making. Who ultimately had to weigh up and determine the competing public interest considerations, public health, societal harm, economic damage, and so on? On whose shoulders rested that debate?
That's the job of the Prime Minister, and there's only the Prime Minister that can do that. But I think that wasn't actually a bad way of doing it, to have different interests represented by different Secretaries of State in different departments.
Presumably you needed the advice of your close advisors, your Cabinet Secretary, and those in the civil service, in addition to the advice that you were receiving from your Secretaries of State. Could you give, please, the inquiry an indication as to the identity of the persons upon whom you were most reliant in that debate, in that weighing up exercise?
Well, I don't wish to embarrass distinguished public officials by naming them. I don't know what the.
Well,
I found that civil servants, on the whole, are quite happy to remain anonymous. But I can certainly tell you that I had superb deputy private secretary, a mathematician, an economist who's brilliant in understanding healthcare issues, and an absolutely brilliant private secretary for healthcare.
the inquiry's obviously heard from a number of advisors and civil servants.
I think you've heard from both of those individuals.
So there's no debate about their identity, Mr. Johnson, and no risk.
You may need to make the question a bit more specific,
Yes.
Mr. Keith.
The evidence is, Mr. Johnson, that you received advice from advisors in number 10.
Yes.
Obviously, your chief advisor, Mr. Cummings.
Yes.
You received advice from the cabinet secretary. Firstly,
Yes.
Mark Sedwell, and then latterly Simon Case. You received advice from the CMO,
Yes.
and then the general chief scientific advisor.
Yes, I'm sorry, I should
and former
have
minister.
cited them first, yes.
It's apparent that on top of the formal advisory structures, the meetings with the CMO and the GCSA, the meetings with the cabinet secretary, the meetings with your ministers, you had a profusion of meetings with your chief advisor, Mr. Cummings, with your cabinet secretary, with your principal private secretary, and so on. There were a huge number of rolling meetings with your innermost group of advisors. And I want to know to what extent, therefore, you came to rely upon them in the ultimate decision-making process.
I, of course, relied on the advice I was given, but the way it works is advisors advise and ministers decide, and that was what happened.
You received a great deal of advice from the chief medical officer and
Yes.
the government's scientific chief advisor. They were a vital source of advice,
Yes.
that's obvious. You were aware that SAGE met hundreds of times, that's to say the Scientific Advisory Group for Emergencies. Did you ever read their minutes, or were you wholly reliant on the CMO and the GCSA to relay to you what SAGE had said?
I think I did once or twice look at or maybe more than that. I looked at what SAGE had actually said, and SAGE certainly produced a lot of documentation. But I think that the CSA and the CMO did an outstanding job of leading SAGE and of distilling their views and conveying them to me.
The SAGE minutes were described as consensus minutes because they were designed to be read at speed, to be able to get to the heart of the issue immediately on reading them, and to ensure that the advice that was being given would be
Yes.
readily and speedily understood. Did you ever think of calling as a general practice for those minutes so that you could yourself read them? Many of them were only 8 or 9 pages long.
As I say, I think I did from time to time look at the consensus minutes. I think in retrospect it might have been valuable to try to hear the SAGE conversation unpasteurized itself, but I didn't. And I was more than content with the very clear summaries that I was getting from the CSA and the CMO.
There were hundreds of consensus minutes, but you read only, or were given only a fraction of them.
That sounds right to me, yes.
All right. We'll look in detail at some of the scientific debates that engage government, particularly in the middle of March. Behavioural fatigue, herd immunity, the debate about the reasonable worst-case scenario, and so on.
Yes.
Did you not think of looking at the scientific horse in the mouth and seeing what was actually being said by the government's primary scientific advisory committee on these issues when you, as now appears to be the case, you became engaged, particularly in the debate of behavioural fatigue? Why didn't you call for the primary material?
I think that's a good question. I was very, very much impressed by and dependent upon the CMO and the CSA, both of whom are outstanding experts in their field. And it felt to me that I couldn't do better than that.
The CMO and the SCA were, of course, concerned with medicine and science, and SAGE was concerned, as it says on the tin, with science.
Well, CMO is a professor of public health. I mean, he knows an awful lot about epidemiology and public behaviour in an epidemic.
He does. You had no advisory structure around you, however, and by contrast, that dealt with matters such as the economic damage
Yeah.
that would be done by the lockdown decisions, there was no pandemic or civil emergency or societal advisory body which might be thought to be analogous to SAGE. In hindsight, and with the passage of time, do you suggest that there was an absence of a proper advisory structure to deal with the other issues and the other considerations which weighed in the balance when you came to make those final decisions?
I've thought about that a great deal, and I think in the end that there is such a body, and it's called HM Treasury, and that is what they do. And you referred earlier on, Mr. Keith, to the competing perspectives of the Whitehall departments and the secretaries of state, and I think for all its difficulties, I think it did work well in allowing me to get a balance of the argument.
The evidence appears already to suggest that the Chancellor of the Exchequer and then Her Majesty's Treasury had considerable influence over the ultimate decision-making process, because the Chancellor would come and see you in bilateral meetings. There were bilateral meetings in the week of the 16th of March, before the first lockdown decision, in late October, before the second, in the summer of 21, and then again in December of 21 in relation to Omicron, and also Eat Out to help out. But that advice was given to you by the Chancellor and Her Majesty's Treasury in a way that wasn't openly transparent in the way that the SAGE advice was provided to you. There were no minutes disclosed of the advice that you were being given to the public. There was no regular production of material or any kind of published, transparent economic analysis provided to you. Do you think in hindsight that that was an error?
I think that there was certainly transparent economic analysis of the cost of some of the measures that we were obliged to enact, and the fall in GDP, the cost of the CJRS, and the other schemes was plain for all to see. That was all public. Of course, what was not public and is not traditionally public is ministerial conversations and discussion between ministers. But again, I think the perspective that I was being offered by the Treasury was a very useful one, just as the perspective of the Department of Health was a very useful one.
The material, so that's to say diary entries and readouts of minutes and so on, Mr. Johnson, show that the Chancellor of the Exchequer would, in this difficult context of making the ultimate decisions about lockdowns and easing and tiers and so on, often get the last word by way of a bilateral meeting that would take place just before you made a final decision. And also that the Secretary of State for Health and Social Care was occasionally excluded from meetings when public health matters were being discussed. Were you aware of that?
I think that's... I reject that characterisation of what took place. The overwhelming priority of the government was protect the NHS, save lives. That was our objective. And that was where my officials were coming from. That was what we wanted to do. And I think it was important in that context to, there were lots of things we had to do that were very difficult, very costly. And it was right to have endless conversations with the Treasury. This was what we did.
You know, of course, that a great deal of evidence has been given to Milady about the operation and the competence of your administration. It needs to be stated absolutely plainly that the inquiry has absolutely no interest in the salaciousness or the nature of Mr. Cummings's linguistic style or the WhatsApps. But it does have an interest, of course, in whether or not his communications revealed an abusive and misogynistic impact. The WhatsApps and the texts shed a direct light on the competence of the government, how well or not the government machinery operated, what you all thought about each other, and what some of you thought privately about the decisions that were being taken. We're going to look in detail at them later, but it's fair to say that in the round that material paints a appalling picture, not all the time, but at times of incompetence and disarray.
Can I comment on that? I think that the two things need to be separated out there. I think it is certainly true that this inquiry has, and I'm glad of it, has dredged up a phenomenal quantity of the type of material that would never have been available to any previous inquiry into doings in Number 10, because it's WhatsApp communications of a kind that would not have been possible. And that's a good thing, because you can get a texture of the feeling for the relationships and the human beings. I would make a couple of points. First of all, a lot of the language, the style that you refer to is completely unknown to me, or indeed to anybody else not on that group. I've apologised to one particular person who suffered abuse in one of those publicised WhatsApp exchanges. But I would make a distinction between the type of language used and the decision-making processes of the government and what we got done. And I would submit that any powerful and effective government has, and I think of the Thatcher government or the Blair government, has a lot of challenging and competing characters whose views about each other might not be fit to print, but to get an awful lot done. And that's what we did.
Your own Cabinet Secretary, Mark Sedwell, he was, of course, asked to move on, and we'll come to that later, in May 2020, described, according to Sir Patrick Vallance, your administration as brutal and useless, and observed that it was hard to motivate people in Number 10 in such terrible times if they were being shot in the back. That would appear to be a reference to the doings, as you say, of Number 10, to the process and the operation of government, as opposed to the atmospherics. Would you not agree?
Again, I think that actually what you're looking at in all this stuff is a lot of highly talented and highly motivated people who are stricken with anxiety about what is happening, about the pandemic, who are doing their best, and who, like all human beings, under great stress and great anxiety about themselves and their own performance, will be inclined to be critical of others. And I think that would have been the same of any administration facing the same sort of challenges on that scale.
But do you accept that there is a considerable body of material which addresses not just their private thoughts of the other individuals in government, of them personally, but relates to the performance of government, to the way in which your administration actually operated? Do you accept that as a general proposition?
I do, and I think that was a good and a healthy thing, because we needed, given the scale of what we were facing, we needed constantly to challenge ourselves and constantly to try to do better.
Your own chief advisor, Mr. Cummings, described on the 4th of May something the government had done as being the best success of the whole criminally incompetent government performance. How could that be a good thing?
Because what he is trying to do is he's not for me to explain his quotation. You can ask him yourself. But what we were generally trying to do was to make sure that we delivered the best possible service for the people of the UK who were going through an absolutely terrible, terrible time. And it would not have been right to have a load of if we'd had a load of WhatsApp saying, "Aren't we doing brilliantly, folks? Isn't this going well?" I think your criticisms might have been, frankly, even more pungent.
On the 27th of March, after Mr. Cummings had asserted that Whitehall had nearly killed huge numbers of people and cost millions of jobs, and that Mr. Hancock had failed to get on top of the testing problems, you yourself said these three words: totally fucking hopeless. That was a reference to the performance of an important part of government.
I'd stress the word nearly in that.
Your response, Mr. Johnson.
And I would say that my job was not uncritically to accept that everything we were doing was good, though I as it happens, as I said to you, I do think that the country as a whole had notable achievements during the crisis. My job was to try to get a load of quite disparate, quite challenging characters to keep going and through a long period, and to keep doing their level best to protect the country. That was my job.
Do you accept the evidence from Helen McNamara, about which you will be aware, and also from former cabinet secretaries, that Mr. Cummings himself contributed to such a toxic atmosphere that civil servants simply didn't want to work in the heart of government? Helen McNamara said the relationships in Number 10 and the Cabinet Office had a real and damaging impact. You were told directly by Simon Case on the 2nd of July, lots of top-drawer people had refused to come to work because of the toxic reputation of your, I emphasize, your operation. Were you aware that there were individuals, civil servants and advisors who were not prepared to work in your administration because of the atmosphere and the working relationships which were in play?
First of all, no. Second, I was not aware of that. Secondly, I didn't see any sign of that. I saw brilliantly talented people when we advertised for a post, when we wanted to recruit for a position in my private office. We had, as far as I could see, no difficulty getting wonderful people to step forward. I think, if I might make one self-criticism, or another self-criticism, I think that the gender balance of my team should have been better. And to your earlier question, looking back at it, when I was running London, it was great and it was 50-50 and it was a very harmonious team. I think sometimes during the pandemic, too many meetings were too male-dominated, if I'm absolutely honest with you. And I think that was I tried sometimes to rectify it. I tried to recruit a former colleague from City Hall, but I think that was something we should have done better.
Simon Case, who was then the Permanent Secretary in Number 10, WhatsApped you yourself on the 2nd of July to say that lots of people, lots of top-drawer people had refused to come because of the toxic reputation of your operation.
Well, I don't remember that.
What did you do?
I don't remember that. And my impression was that we had no difficulty recruiting the best possible people.
Could we have, please, 48313, page 16, on the screen? These are communications between Mr. Cummings and yourself in May 2020. We're concerned with the bottom half of the page.
So can you expand it, because I can't?
Yes, 7th of May, Hancock is unfit for this job. The incompetence, the constant lies, the obsession with media bullshit. Reference to testing. You must ask him where we'll get to 500,000 per day and where's your plan for testing. And if you can scroll back out.
But
just pause a second, Mr. Johnson. If you then scroll in, please, to the bottom half of the page, the last part. Mr. Cummings says, it'll certainly be a cock-up like everything else, but it'll be far from the worst of our cock-ups over the next 8 weeks. You need to think of Binny Hancock, and so on and so forth. You cannot suggest that you are unaware of the opinion taken by your chief advisor over your Secretary of State for Health. You cannot suggest you are unaware of the concerns expressed by your Cabinet Secretary about the toxic reputation of your operation, because he WhatsApped you directly. You cannot suggest that there weren't grave concerns being expressed in Downing Street, that there were people who simply would not come and work for you because of the atmosphere you allowed to develop.
So, first of all, in politics, there's never a time when you're not, if you're Prime Minister, you are constantly being lobbied by somebody to sack somebody else. It's just what I'm afraid happens, and it's part of life. Everybody's constantly militating against some other individual for some reason of their own. It's just that I'm afraid that's the nature of it. It is perfectly true that this advisor in particular thought had a low opinion of the Health Secretary. I thought he was wrong. I stuck by the Health Secretary. I thought the Health Secretary worked very hard, and whatever, he may have had defects, but I thought that he was doing his best in very difficult circumstances, and I thought he was a good communicator.
Could we have 303-245, your first and then your second Cabinet Secretary communicate by WhatsApp, page 9. Mr. Case refers at the top of the page to how you have told Mr. Cummings outright to stop talking to the media in his presence. This place is just insane, zero discipline. And then in the bottom half of the page, these people are so mad, madly self-defeating. It's hard to ask people to march. It should be to the sound of gunfire. And then the Cabinet Secretary. The Cabinet Secretary is the head of the civil service. Is he or she not? I've never seen a bunch of people less well equipped to run a country. That's not a matter of atmospherics or lobbying or part of the general day in, day out friction within government, is it?
Yes, I think it is. And I think that as I say, if you'd had the views of the Mandarinate about the Thatcher government in unexpurgated WhatsApps, milady, I think you would have found that they were pretty fruity. It's WhatsApp conversation is intended to be, though clearly it isn't, ephemeral. It tends to the pejorative and the hyperbolical. And I think that the worst vice, in my view, would have been to have had an operation where everybody was so deferential and so reluctant to make waves that they never expressed their opinion, they never challenged, and they never doubted. It was much more important to have a group of people who are willing to doubt themselves and to doubt each other. And I think that was creatively useful rather than the reverse.
Some of these senior advisors didn't just lack deference, to use your word, Mr. Johnson. They doubted you, and they doubted your ability and your competence, as you now know from having seen the material. Could we have, please, 273901, page 188. That's from the 19th of September. page 229. There is a reference to leadership position.
Would you like me to?
Yes, I'm just going to put, because it's right and proper that, and fair that you're asked to give your response to some of the material which has been produced to this inquiry. And then page 245. The Prime Minister begins to argue for letting it all rip. They've had a good innings. And there is a reference there to lack of leadership, the last line. This all feels like a complete lack of leadership.
Look,
let me put the question, whether or not these significant number of advisors correctly stated the position, whether or not this was genuine, whether or not there were significant failings in your own and your government's competence, would you accept that it is extraordinary that the government's chief scientific advisor, its chief advisor, its cabinet secretaries, its deputy cabinet secretary, should all be commenting in these terms about competence and about performance and about you?
I think this is wholly to be expected, and this is a period in which we are where the country is going through a resurgence of the virus. You're looking at the October period, and Patrick, the CSA, talks about inconsistency, and we've just got to face the reality. I've got to face the reality as Prime Minister that the virus seems to be refusing to be suppressed by the measures we've used so far. We're going to need different measures. We've come out of lockdown. We're going into the tiering system. Of course we're changing, but so did the collective understanding of the science. And if you look back at what happened during COVID, we had radically different views over the period, over the efficacy of masks, over whether asymptomatic transmission could take place. We had a totally different view within months about whether ventilators would be needed. I was told to begin with we needed 25% of patients would need ventilators. That turned out not to be true. Then on this particular issue, you've got the scientists calling for us to go early and go hard, and this takes us back to your initial line of questioning. When earlier on, they had been saying expressly that if you go hard too soon, then you have two problems: behavioural fatigue and bounce back. And the problem that I was facing, and it was an appalling problem in October, was that we didn't have therapeutics, or we didn't have, well, we had some therapeutics, but we didn't have a vaccine. We didn't have a way out, a medical solution. We were being forced to use NPIs. And at this particular moment, I'm sure we'll come to the October-November lockdowns, my anxiety was that we were going to have to do the same thing over and over again. And I think what those notebooks reflect and what all those comments reflect is the deep anxiety of a group of people doing their level best who cannot see an easy solution and are naturally self-critical and critical of others.
All right. It's obvious that these things were said at the time. You say not to you, although I've put to you a WhatsApp which was sent directly to you. And there are obviously others.
Well, it's a WhatsApp that claims to have said something directly to me.
Well, the WhatsApp has been taken, of course, from the material which you've provided and from, obviously, the phones from other people who were interlocutors for the same
Sorry, if
conversation.
I may correct you, Mr. Keith, what that WhatsApp was a WhatsApp from the Cabinet Secretary saying that he told me directly something. I don't think I saw the WhatsApp directly to me.
Mark Sedwell, on the 2nd of July, WhatsApped you directly to say lots of top drawer people had refused to come because of the toxic reputation of your operation.
I'm sorry.
Whether this material indicates a significant failing at the heart of government and in failures of competence, they undoubtedly, well, these opinions were expressed at the time, and you no doubt accept you're responsible for that state of affairs. You must have reflected, Mr. Johnson, long and hard, both whilst in office, in your dealings with Mr. Cummings, and afterwards, on what lessons can be learned from the way in which power is exercised and the way in which government performs at the highest level. Have you reflected upon whether or not the system of SPADs, the system by which you receive advice from your political advisors, needs to be reformed? Have you reflected on the function and powers and the extent of powers of SPADs, or on the competence of the ministers whose advice you accepted?
Well, I think with hindsight, there's all sorts of things that you could do differently. I think at the time, I decided that it was best to have an atmosphere of challenge with some strong characters giving me advice, and I valued that advice.
Well, with hindsight, you can now see what was going on, and you've had this material for some time. Have you reflected on whether or not the inquiry could, if my lady sees fit, make recommendations about the way in which a character such as Mr. Cummings, about whom some extremely strong views have been expressed, should be in the position that he was? Views on whether or not the Prime Minister had access to the correct and proper forms of advice? Are these not issues that you've thought about?
Yes, but I think overwhelmingly that I did have access to the correct and proper forms of advice. And if you ask upon whom I relied for that advice, it was the CMO and the CSA, together with the experts, the officials in my private office.
You lost confidence in your Cabinet Secretary in May 2020, did you not?
Well, he asked to step aside.
Did you lose confidence in your Cabinet Secretary in May 2020?
Yeah, he asked to step aside.
Did you lose confidence in your Chief Advisor, whom you described as engaging in an orgy of narcissism at the heart of your administration?
Well, I think he also stepped aside.
Did you lose confidence in those senior advisors, Mr. Johnson, and effectively dispose of them both?
Well, they both stepped aside from government, but it was a very difficult, very challenging period. People were getting, as you can see from the WhatsApps, they were getting very frazzled because they were frustrated. COVID kept coming at us in wave after wave, and it was very, very hard to fight it. And people were doing their level best. And I don't, when people are critical of the guy at the top, or they're critical of each other, that's a reflection of the difficulty of the circumstances. When it became easier in the spring and during the vaccine rollout, people's tone changed. Of course it did, but it was a reflection of the agony that the country was going through and that the government was going through.
Ladies, that's a convenient moment. I'm about to turn to a completely separate topic.
Right. I shall return at 20 past.
Thank you.
disclose all relevant information. In light of those words, could I just ask you, please, to confirm what your approach has been to the disclosure of your own COVID-related emails, WhatsApps and notes?
I've done my best to give everything of any conceivable relevance.
Has that always been your position, Mr. Johnson?
Yes.
Could we have 265619, please, page 68? This is a WhatsApp between your former Permanent Secretary, number 10, and then latterly Cabinet Secretary, and your principal private secretary, Simon Cain, respectively Martin Reynolds. And the Cabinet Secretary said the Prime Minister is mad if he doesn't think his WhatsApps will become public via the COVID inquiry. He was clearly not in the mood for that discussion tonight. That date, the 20th of December 2021, was just 5 days after you had in fact appointed Milady as the chair of this inquiry. Was there a debate at that time within government as to whether or not your WhatsApps should be disclosed? And if so, whether or not they would become public by virtue of their disclosure in this process?
I don't remember that, the conversation to which the Cabinet Secretary is referring, and I've handed over all the relevant WhatsApps.
The inquiry has indeed requested all the key COVID-related texts, WhatsApps and so on from January 20 to February 22, and it must be made absolutely clear that throughout the course of the litigation in the summer and throughout these proceedings, you have made available, it would seem, everything in your possession. You made clear, I think, through your solicitors, however, that you had a phone which you used from May 2021, and you've made available the WhatsApps and the emails from that phone, therefore, between May 21 and February 22, the end of the period that the inquiry was requesting about. But following a well-publicised security breach, you had not been able to use to access the previous phone because you'd stopped using it, and you were fearful that if you tried to access it, you'd delete its data. Is that right?
That's right.
Were you able to get access, ultimately, to the contents of that first phone, the old phone?
Yes, so we sent it off to some technical people, and they activated it.
Was there a time gap, as your solicitors have described it, on that phone, a period between the 30th of January 2020 and June 2020, during which time the WhatsApps have not been capable of being reinstalled and disclosed?
That's right.
Do you know why your phone was missing those 5,000 odd WhatsApps?
I don't know the exact reason, but it looks as though it's something to do with the app going down and then coming up again, but somehow not automatically erasing all the things between that date when it went down and the moment when it was last backed up. So I can't give you the technical explanation, but that's the best I'm able to give.
The technical report that your solicitors kindly provided demonstrates that there may have been a factory reset of the phone at the end of January 2020 and then an attempt to reinstall the contents later in June 2020. May I just ask you this? Was it you, if that was a factory reset that was done, was it you that tried to reset the phone or not?
A factory reset?
There is a device or a capability on the phone which allows its contents to be entirely reset. That wasn't you.
I don't remember any such thing.
All right. And during the course of the litigation this summer, between the inquiry and the Cabinet Office, did you, of course, make plain your stated wish that the WhatsApps, which were the subject of that litigation, should be disclosed?
Yes.
They being your own WhatsApps. All right.
Can I, for the avoidance of doubt, make it absolutely clear I haven't removed any WhatsApps from my phone, and I've given you everything that I think you need.
I ask Mr. Johnson because this issue has been trailed in the press.
Yeah, no, I get you.
And it's important that you have an opportunity of explaining why those WhatsApps are not available. In your witness statement, at paragraph 10, you say, Mr. Johnson, that unquestionably mistakes were made. And for those, you say you unreservedly apologise. We have the statement there. I'd like you, please, to set out in broad terms, of course we'll be looking at the detail of it later, but in broad terms, what mistakes you refer to there. Bearing in mind that we are only concerned in this module, Mr. Johnson, with the core decision-making, with the lockdown decisions, the NPIs, the non-pharmaceutical interventions and so on, not vaccines, therapeutics, antivirals. Okay. What mistakes do you unquestionably accept were made?
Well, I think if you look at my statement, I point out that we were relying so much on messaging to help contain the virus, and we needed the public to understand the message in as straightforward a way as possible, and they really did, by and large. One problem we had that I mention is that because of the very natural and proper right of the devolved administrations to have their own approach, sometimes there was a bit of so the BBC News would have one message from number 10, then a slightly different one from Scotland or wherever, and that I think we need to sort that out in future. And I'm sure there are plenty of other things that we could have done differently, but I have no doubt it will come to them in the course of the examination.
So your position today is, and you appear to refer to it as the first issue, that the primary mistake made rests in the context of the messaging and the communications of the devolved administration.
Well, you asked me to cite a mistake that we made. I didn't say that was the primary mistake.
What primary mistakes, Mr. Johnson, are you referring to in paragraph 10 when you say there was terrible suffering, but in relation to which, where we failed, I apologise again? For what are you apologising in that statement?
Well, I think just to go back to your main point, which is that so many people suffered, so many people lost their lives. Inevitably, in the course of trying to handle a very, very difficult pandemic in which we had to balance appalling harms on either side of the decision, we may have made mistakes. I don't want to try to anticipate the discussion, which I'm sure we will get into, about the timings of MPIs, of lockdowns. Inevitably, we got some things wrong. I think we were doing our best at the time, given what we knew, given the information I had available to me at the time. I think we did our level best. Were there things that we should have
Mr.
done
Johnson, we're
differently?
now going to turn to look at the events of January and February.
But
in your witness statement, you say that Mr. Hancock spoke to you about his concerns
in a hierarchy.
Around about the 7th of January.
I think
you say he rang you again on the 22nd of January.
I find it easier
to put this in its proper chronological place. The first sage had taken place on the 22nd of January, the first Cobra on the 24th of January. He says, however, in his witness statement that he called you directly on at least 4 occasions during January to try and impress upon you his concerns, as opposed to accepting it on behalf of your administration. Although he does not say so, the implication is that
responsibility for all the decisions that we made.
Was at pains to try to alert you to the problem as he saw it, and he was required to raise the matter many repeatedly. Do you recall a repeated number of decisions resting upon your own shoulders as Prime Minister?
I certainly recall the conversation on the 7th of
Do you take
January,
responsibility
and
for whatever my lady makes of the speed of the government's
the context,
response?
and I remember
January,
thinking
February,
about
March
it and saying
of
to him, well,
2020.
keep an eye on it. And
the way in which the
said out
various
in
moving
my
parts of the
statement,
government, the advisory committees,
my initial
the departments,
instincts
the agencies and so on
about it.
responded.
I don't,
Do you take responsibility
to be frank, remember
for the
all
lockdown
those
decisions, whichever way they went,
but
and their timeliness,
it's true that we would have
whatever my
spoken
lady
on
makes of them?
many occasions because we
The
generally
manner in
spoke
which patients were
quite
discharged from
quite a lot.
hospitals into the care sector.
I think that
The explosion of the virus
in that
within
period,
the residential care sector.
January really to the end of
The
February,
general speed at which the restrictions were
towards the
eased.
end of February.
The attack
COVID
to
was
health
pretty
hand
much
scheme.
like a cloud on the horizon, no bigger than a man's
And then,
hand. And
latterly,
you didn't know
2020, the
whether it was going to
decision
turn
not to
into
introduce a circuit breaker
typhoon
in September
or not. And
or October,
I certainly
or to introduce a
didn't. I was
tier
unsure.
system earlier when the
And
prevalence of
it
the
became
virus
clear much later.
was. The matter was first raised with your
good
Cabinet
or ill.
Secretary, Mark
Yes, so we did have
Sendall,
local
formally on the
restrictions
21st of
for local
January, which was the date, in
May I
fact, of
just
the
ask
World
you,
Health
please,
Organization
this question?
first novel coronavirus
Also,
situation
you-
report. Do you recall when the matter
You
was
referred
first
to
brought
mistakes.
officially
It's very
to your
important.
attention?
You are
Inquiry
obviously aware from
understands
news
to what
reports,
extent, and you'd been
it's
aware from your
acceptable that there
conversations
were
with Mr.
mistakes as
Hancock
opposed
as
to
the
an
possible
acceptance that with hindsight,
crisis
the government
or
could
the
have done
emergence of this
better.
virus
Do you
in
mean
China?
there were
But when
failings,
officially do you
things or
recall
decisions
it
that
was
you got
put
avoidably
before you?
wrong, whether because they were the wrong
I'm sure
decisions
it's
or
in my,
because
in what
your
I've submitted to
management
the
and
inquiry,
leadership meant that
Mr.
the
Keith,
right
I think
decisions were
that
less
you-
likely to
certainly
be
there
taken?
are cabinet discussions in January and in February, and a crescendo of activity about it. But in government, it wasn't yet being escalated to me as something of really truly national concern.
Indeed.